Here's something that should keep you awake at night. The person with the nuclear codes, the commander-in-chief of the world's most powerful military, the leader of the world's largest economy, stood in front of reporters on March 13th, 2025, and demonstrated he doesn't understand basic economics. And what he said wasn't just wrong. It was the kind of wrong that if anyone actually tried to implement it, would cause economic devastation on a scale America hasn't experienced since the Great Depression. We don't need their cars, we don't need their energy, we don't need their lumber, we don't need anything that they give. Donald Trump said those words about Canada, not about some distant adversary, about the country that shares the longest international border in the world with the United States, 5,525 miles of it. About the nation that's been America's closest ally and most reliable trading partner for over a century. About an economy so deeply integrated with America's that separating them would be like trying to separate conjoined twins without killing both patients. And here's what makes this terrifying. Most people heard that statement and thought it sounded strong, confident, patriotic even. America first. But I'm going to show you exactly what that statement means in concrete terms. What it would do to your gas bill, your grocery bill, your electricity, your ability to buy a car, your ability to heat your home, because the gap between that confident rhetoric and the actual reality of how America functions is so vast that crossing it would destroy the American economy. Let me start with energy, because this is where you'd feel the impact first, fastest, and most painfully. Every single day, without exception, 4.3 million barrels of crude oil cross from Canada into the United States. That's not a weekly figure. That's daily, 4.3 million barrels every 24 hours. To put that in perspective, that's more oil than most countries on Earth produce in total. And it represents 63% of all crude oil imports entering the United States. Canada isn't just America's largest foreign oil supplier. The gap between Canada and the second largest supplier is so enormous there's no meaningful comparison. Saudi Arabia, which most Americans probably think of as America's main oil source, provides less than half what Canada does. Now here's where this gets fascinating and reveals just how disconnected Trump's statement is from reality. The United States is currently the world's #1 oil producer. American oil fields are pumping out roughly 13 million barrels per day, more than Saudi Arabia's 11 million, more than Russia's 10 million. American energy dominance is real. So the obvious question becomes, if America produces so much oil, why does it need to import 4.3 million barrels daily from Canada? The answer exposes something fundamental about how energy infrastructure actually works. American refineries, particularly the massive industrial complexes throughout the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast, were specifically designed and built decades ago, in some cases going back to the 1970s and 1980s, to process heavy crude oil. Not just any oil, heavy crude, the thick, viscous, sulfur-rich crude that comes from Canadian oil sands in Alberta. This crude is chemically and physically different from the light sweet crude that most American wells produce, especially the shale oil from places like Texas and North Dakota. You can't just pour one type of crude into a refinery designed for another. It's not like substituting regular gas for premium in your car. The entire refinery infrastructure, from the distillation columns to the cracking units to the desulfurization systems, is engineered around specific crude properties. Converting a refinery from heavy to light crude requires complete reconstruction of core processing unit. We're talking about investments in the range of $2 to $5 billion per facility and construction timelines of 3 to 5 years, assuming you can even get permits and environmental approvals. Let me give you specific examples to make this concrete. Marathon Petroleum operates a refinery in Robinson, Illinois, processing roughly 206,000 barrels per day. 100% of that crude, every single barrel, comes from Canada. Not 95%, not 80%, 100%. Flint Hills Resources runs a refinery in Rosemount, Minnesota, processing 320,000 barrels per day of Canadian crude. Phillips 66 operates facilities in Wood River, Illinois, and Ponca City, Oklahoma, heavily dependent on Canadian supply. BP's Whiting Refinery in Indiana, one of the largest in the country, processing 435,000 barrels daily, was specifically upgraded in a $4 billion investment to process heavy Canadian crude. According to data from the Alberta Petroleum Marketing Commission, which tracks these flows meticulously, 14 major American refineries depend on Canadian crude for more than 75% of their feedstock. These aren't small operations. Combined, they process over 3 million barrels daily. If Canadian supply stopped tomorrow, these facilities would face immediate shutdowns, not reduced operations, complete shutdowns. You cannot run a refinery designed for heavy crude on light crude without fundamental reconstruction. So what happens to gasoline prices if 4.3 million barrels per day suddenly disappears from American supply? Energy economists, including teams at Stanford, MIT, and the Energy Information Administration, have modeled this exact scenario. The consensus range is 30 to 70 cents per gallon increase within 2 to 3 weeks. But that's the optimistic scenario, assuming orderly markets. In reality, with panic buying, speculation, and the market chaos that always accompanies sudden supply shocks, prices could spike higher and faster. During the 2008 oil crisis, when supply disruptions were far smaller than losing Canada would cause, prices jumped over $1 per gallon in less than a month. And we're not just talking about inconvenience or minor cost increases. For a family driving two vehicles 15,000 miles annually each, that's an additional $1,800 to $2,500 per year just in gasoline costs. For trucking companies operating on thin margins, for delivery services, for any business using vehicles, costs spike immediately. Those costs get passed to consumers through higher prices for everything transported by truck, which is essentially everything you buy. But crude oil is just the beginning of the energy story. Natural gas reveals even more about America's structural dependence on Canada. In 2024, the United States imported 8.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas from Canada every single day. To put that volume in perspective, that's enough gas to heat every home in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania for an entire winter. And that 8.5 billion cubic feet represents roughly 95% of all pipeline natural gas imports into the United States. Almost every cubic foot of gas crossing American borders through pipelines comes from Canada. The infrastructure moving this gas south is absolutely massive. Major pipeline systems like the TransCanada system, the Alliance Pipeline, the Vector Pipeline, all built over decades at cost totaling over $30 billion, were engineered specifically around the assumption that Canadian gas flows south to American markets, while American gas flows to coastal LNG export terminals for shipment to Asia and Europe. This infrastructure cannot be quickly repurposed or redirected. But national statistics hide critical regional vulnerabilities. New York and New England don't just import some Canadian gas to supplement domestic production. They fundamentally depend on it for basic functioning. Boston Gas serves 860,000 customers. National Grid serves 3.6 million customers across New York and Massachusetts. During peak winter demand, when temperatures drop below freezing and heating systems run constantly, Canadian Natural Gas supplies 40 to 60% of their total gas flowing through the system. It's not a supplement. It's essential for keeping homes heated and lights on. Consolidated Edison, serving New York City and Westchester County with 1 million electric customers and 1.1 million gas customers, depends heavily on Canadian supply during peak periods. When the polar vortex hit in January 2024, causing temperatures to plummet to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of New England, Canadian gas supply was the only thing preventing widespread blackouts and heating failures. The regional grid operator, ISO New England, issued statements making clear that without Canadian natural gas, they would have been forced to implement rotating blackouts affecting millions. Seth Bloomsack, who directs energy studies at Penn State and has advised both government and utilities for over 20 years, puts it bluntly, If Canadian natural gas imports were disrupted during winter peak demand, you'd see rolling blackouts across the Northeast within 48 to 72 hours. And those blackouts wouldn't just be inconvenient. In sub-zero temperatures, they'd be deadly. Emergency rooms would fill with hypothermia cases. Pipes would freeze and burst, causing billions in property damage. The entire regional economy would effectively shut down. And then there's electricity imported directly. In 2024, the United States imported 48 billion kilowatt hours of electricity from Canada. That's enough to power roughly 4 million American homes for an entire year. Most of that power, about 85%, is clean hydroelectric power generated by massive dams in Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. This isn't fossil fuel generation. It's renewable emissions-free power that states like New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont have been purchasing as part of their climate strategies. New York alone imported 9 billion kilowatt hours of Canadian electricity in 2024, representing about 5% of the state's total consumption. But that percentage is misleading because the imports are concentrated in specific regions. Northern and Western New York depend much more heavily on Canadian power. If that supply stopped, replacing it would require bringing old natural gas and oil-fired plants back online, exactly the facilities these states have been trying to retire to meet climate goals. Emissions would spike, air quality would deteriorate, electricity prices would increase substantially, and decades of climate progress would evaporate. Now let me shift to something most Americans never think about but absolutely cannot live without: critical minerals and rare earth elements. The United States Geological Survey identifies 50 minerals as critical to economic security and national security. These aren't arbitrary designations. These are materials that advanced economies cannot function without. Out of those 50 critical minerals, the United States is 100% import reliant on 12 of them. Zero domestic production. None. For another 29 of those critical minerals, America depends on imports for more than half its supply. Canada is a mineral superpower in a way most Americans don't appreciate. Canadian geology, the result of ancient volcanic activity and glaciation, created some of the richest mineral deposits on Earth. Canada produces over 60 different minerals and metals commercially. That includes 21 of the 50 minerals on America's critical list. Canada is also the only Western Hemisphere source and one of the only sources outside China for 10 of the 12 minerals that NATO specifically identifies as defense critical. Let me give you very specific examples with real numbers. Potash. Canada controls roughly 30% of global potash production, the largest source on Earth. Saskatchewan alone produces about 20 million metric tons annually. The United States imports approximately 90% of its potash, with the vast majority coming from Canadian sources. Potash is absolutely essential for fertilizer production. It provides the potassium that crops need to grow. Without adequate potash, corn yields drop by 30 to 50%. Wheat yields fall by 20 to 40%. Soybean production craters. If Canadian potash supply were disrupted, American fertilizer production would collapse within months as existing stockpiles ran out. Farmers would face severe shortages during spring planting season. The economic impact would be catastrophic. The American Farm Bureau estimated in a 2023 report that a sustained potash shortage would reduce agricultural output by $40 to $60 billion annually. Food prices would spike 15 to 25% within a year, and this wouldn't just hurt American consumers. The United States is the world's largest agricultural exporter. Global food prices would surge, potentially triggering food security crises in developing countries. Uranium. Canada is the world's second largest uranium producer after Kazakhstan, producing roughly 8,000 metric tons annually, about 13% of global supply. The United States has 93 operating nuclear reactors, providing 19.6% of total electricity generation. These reactors consumed approximately 41 million pounds of uranium in 2024. Domestic U.S. uranium production in 2024 was under 1 million pounds. The remaining 40 million pounds came from imports, with Canada and Kazakhstan being the primary suppliers. But here's the critical issue. Kazakhstan is closely aligned with Russia. In fact, much of Kazakhstan's uranium processing happens in Russian facilities. Given current tensions with Russia, U.S. utilities have been systematically trying to reduce dependency on Kazakhstani sources and increase Canadian supply. If the Canadian relationship deteriorates and Canadian uranium supply becomes unreliable, American nuclear plants face a genuine crisis. They can't just switch to Russian-influenced supply for obvious security reasons. They'd be forced to reduce output or shut down entirely. Losing 20% of electricity generation would cause blackouts, spike prices, and force rapid expansion of fossil fuel generation with massive emissions increases. Nickel. Canada is the world's fifth largest nickel producer. Nickel is absolutely essential for stainless steel production and, increasingly critically, for electric vehicle batteries. Modern EV batteries use nickel-rich chemistries to improve energy density and range. The Vale mine in Sudbury, Ontario produces roughly 40,000 metric tons annually. About 60% of nickel consumed in the United States comes from Canadian sources. Disrupting that supply would hit the EV industry hard, just as it's trying to scale up to meet federal mandates and consumer demand. But here's what should genuinely alarm anyone thinking about national security and defense: rare earth elements. The 17 metallic elements that are absolutely essential for virtually every piece of modern military technology and advanced electronics. These aren't called rare because they're scarce in the Earth's crust. They're actually relatively abundant. They're called rare because they're extremely difficult and expensive to process, requiring complex chemical separation that's environmentally nasty, and China has spent decades perfecting the process and undercutting competition. China currently refines over 90% of the world's rare earth elements, a near monopoly more complete than OPEC ever achieved with oil. China's Baotou region alone processes more rare earths than the rest of the world combined. The national security implications are staggering. F-35 fighter jets require roughly 920 pounds of rare earth materials per aircraft. Each Virginia-class submarine uses approximately 9,000 pounds. Precision-guided missiles, advanced radar systems, satellite technology all depend on rare earths for critical components. The Pentagon has been desperately trying for over a decade to reduce this dangerous dependence on China. The strategy that emerged after years of study was clear: partner with Canada and Australia to build North American and allied processing capacity. Canada has substantial rare earth deposits. Mountain Pass mine in California, the only significant American rare earth mine, ships its ore to China for processing because there's no domestic processing capacity. The plan was to build processing facilities in Canada and the US, creating a secure supply chain independent of Chinese control. MP Materials, which operates Mountain Pass, announced plans in 2022 for a processing facility in Texas. But the project depends critically on partnership with Canadian mining operations and processing expertise. If the Canadian relationship collapses, if Canada becomes unreliable or hostile due to annexation threats and trade wars, this entire strategy falls apart. America remains dependent on China for materials essential to every advanced weapons system. And it's not just about future security. The threat is immediate and has been demonstrated. In April 2025, China restricted exports of gallium, germanium, antimony, tungsten, and high-purity graphite to the United States, just 5 materials. The impact was instant and severe. Ford Motor Company had to halt production at its Chicago assembly plant, which builds 250,000 vehicles annually, because of shortages in rare earth magnets needed for electric power steering systems. Each vehicle requires dozens of these magnets. Without them, you can't build the car. Tesla faced similar disruptions at its Fremont factory in California and its Austin facility in Texas. GM issued warnings that some plants could face shutdowns within weeks. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation, representing virtually every major automaker, sent urgent letters to the Commerce Department warning that sustained rare earth restrictions would paralyze American vehicle manufacturing. One brief export restriction from one country nearly stopped American auto production. And we're talking about 5 materials, not the full range China controls. Speaking of automotive manufacturing, the integration between American and Canadian auto production isn't just deep, it's cellular. The automotive supply chain in North America was deliberately engineered over generations to maximize efficiency through specialization and just-in-time delivery. A single vehicle assembled in Detroit or Toledo or Louisville might cross the US-Canada border 6, 7, sometimes 8 times during its production cycle. Here's how it actually works on the ground. Let's trace a Ford F-150, America's best-selling vehicle, through its production chain. Aluminum sheet metal gets produced at Alcoa's facility in Deschambault, Quebec. That aluminum ships to Michigan for stamping into body panels at a specialized facility in Sterling Heights. Those stamp panels go back to Canada to an assembly operation in Oakville, Ontario for initial body construction. The partially assembled body returns to Ford's Dearborn truck plant in Michigan. Meanwhile, the engine built in Windsor, Ontario, crosses into Michigan for integration. The transmission from Livonia Transmission in Michigan gets added. Seats manufactured in Canada by Magna International get installed. Wheels and tires produced in Canadian facilities get added at the very end. This isn't bureaucratic inefficiency or poor planning. This is ruthless optimization. Each facility specializes in specific processes where it's achieved maximum efficiency through decades of experience and capital investment. Magna International, headquartered in Canada, is one of the world's largest auto suppliers with 175,000 employees and facilities throughout North America. In 2024, Magna supplied $42 billion worth of components to American auto manufacturers. That's more than the GDP of 130 countries. Ontario alone supports 675,000 direct and indirect jobs in automotive. But those aren't just Canadian jobs, serving Canadian markets. The majority of that employment exists specifically to supply American auto manufacturing. According to a 2024 study by the Center for Automotive Research in Ann Arbor, Michigan, approximately 450,000 American auto manufacturing jobs depend directly on Canadian parts supply, not depend on cheap Canadian labor. Canada pays similar wages to the US, depend on Canadian technical capabilities, specialized facilities, and production capacity that simply doesn't exist in the United States. Linamar Corporation, based in Guelph, Ontario, manufactures precision engine components, transmission parts, and driveline components in highly specialized facilities. Their engines, cylinder heads, used in millions of American vehicles, are produced in plants that took decades to optimize and billions to build. There's no American facility currently producing equivalent components at equivalent scale and quality. If Canadian supply were disrupted, American automakers couldn't just call up an alternative supplier. The alternative doesn't exist. The phrase industry analysts use to describe this level of integration is you can't unscramble an egg. And it's not just North American integration, it's USMCA integration. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which replaced NAFTA in 2020, was specifically negotiated to lock in and deepen this integration. The agreement requires 75% North American content for vehicles to qualify for tariff-free treatment, up from 62.5% under NAFTA. It mandates specific percentages of high-wage labor. It includes enforcement mechanisms for labor and environmental standards. This wasn't a casual trade deal. This was a comprehensive framework for integrated manufacturing negotiated over 3 years with input from thousands of industry experts. The entire agreement was designed around certainty and predictability. Companies made multi-billion-dollar investment decisions based on assumptions that this framework would remain stable. GM invested $1 billion in facilities in Michigan and $1.3 billion in Ontario, specifically because of USMCA certainty. Ford announced $11 billion in investments across North American facilities through 2025, again based on USMCA stability. But when the president who negotiated USMCA now threatens to make Canada the 51st state, when he imposes tariffs that violate the agreement's spirit, when he publicly declares America doesn't need Canadian goods, that certainty evaporates. Investment decisions get delayed or canceled. Companies develop contingency plans. Some begin exploring moving operations to Mexico or Europe, where political risk seems lower. And let me be very clear about the trade numbers, because facts matter more than rhetoric. In 2024, the United States imported $422 billion worth of goods from Canada. America exported $348 billion to Canada. That's a goods trade deficit of $74 billion. But that figure is misleading in important ways. First, it doesn't include services trade, where America runs a substantial surplus. Including services, the total trade deficit shrinks to between $36 and $45 billion, depending on measurement methodology. Second, and more importantly, that $74 billion deficit isn't money given away. Americans receive $422 billion in value, energy that keeps factories running, minerals that go into electronics and vehicles, components that build American products, lumber that constructs American homes. These are real goods that American consumers and businesses need, want, and voluntarily purchase because they provide value. The president repeatedly claims the trade deficit is $200 billion. He stated this figure dozens of times. That number appears nowhere in official data. Not from the U.S. Census Bureau's trade database, not from Statistics Canada, not from the USTR, not from any credible source. It's inflated by roughly factor of 4. But even if it were accurate, trade deficits aren't inherently bad. Germany runs trade surpluses with nearly everyone, but no one thinks Germany is exploiting its partners. China runs massive surpluses. Japan runs surpluses. Trade balances reflect different economic structures, savings rates, currency values, and comparative advantages, not winner and loser relationships. And the dependency runs both ways in ways most Americans never consider. Take electricity infrastructure. There are 86 international transmission lines physically connecting American states to Canadian provinces. These aren't just backup connections. They're integral to how both countries' grids function. In 2024, while Canada exported 48 billion kilowatt hours to the US, America exported 13 billion kilowatt hours to Canada. The flows go both ways based on demand, generation capacity, and price signals. When Texas faced its catastrophic grid failure in February 2021 during winter storms, killing over 200 people and causing $195 billion in economic damage, Canadian provinces offered to export emergency power. The interconnections saved lives. When California faces summer heat waves and peak demand, imports from British Columbia help prevent blackouts. These interconnections make both countries more resilient. Or consider refined petroleum products. While Canada exports crude to the US, it imports gasoline and diesel from American refineries. Quebec in particular depends on refined products from Gulf Coast refineries transported via Colonial Pipeline and other systems. Montreal's 135,000 barrel per day refinery processes crude transported through the US. If that relationship became hostile, Quebec faces energy security problems while American refineries lose a customer. Natural gas flows both ways too. While the U.S. imports 8.5 billion cubic feet daily from Canada, roughly 2.4 billion cubic feet daily flows from the U.S. to Ontario and other Canadian provinces. American LNG export facilities on the Gulf Coast process natural gas that sometimes transits through Canada. The infrastructure is interconnected. Right now, as of January 2026, trust in this partnership is collapsing at alarming speed. Trump hasn't just suggested once that Canada should become the 51st state. He's repeated it consistently. He posts on social media multiple times weekly about Canadian annexation. He refers to Prime Minister Mark Carney as Governor Carney, not as a slip of the tongue, but as consistent policy. He's posted AI-generated maps showing Canada, Greenland, and Venezuela colored as American territory. He suggested at Davos in January 2026 that America might use military force to acquire Greenland from Denmark, a NATO ally, making every ally wonder if territorial integrity still means anything. Canadian public opinion has hardened dramatically. Polling by Angus Reid Institute in December 2025 showed 90% of Canadians oppose annexation, up from 82% in March 2025. More remarkably, an Ipsos poll found 82% of Canadians would rather rejoin the British Commonwealth as a dominion than become American. Think about that for a moment. Canadians would prefer going backwards 60 years to pre-full independence status than joining the United States. That's how strongly they value their sovereignty. And this isn't just public opinion. It's unified across the political spectrum in a way almost nothing else in Canadian politics is. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who generally aligns with Trump on many policy issues, stated unequivocally, Canada will never be the 51st state. Our sovereignty is not negotiable, Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney told Trump directly in a phone call. Never, 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 never. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said, we will defend Canadian sovereignty by any means necessary. Provincial premiers, even those generally sympathetic to conservative politics, have united in opposition. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, all opposed to annexation. When politicians who disagree on almost everything agree completely on something, that reveals how fundamental the issue is to national identity. But the damage isn't just diplomatic posturing or hurt feelings. It's material and economic. Investment decisions depend on certainty. When businesses don't know if tariffs will be imposed next month, if borders will be militarized, if trade agreements will be honored, they respond predictably. They stop investing. Canadian business investment in the U.S. fell 8.2% in the first 9 months of 2025 compared to 2024. American business investment in Canada fell 6.7% combined. That's roughly $28 billion in investment. That didn't happen because of uncertainty. And Canada is actively diversifying trade relationships. In the first 10 months of 2025, Canadian exports to the United States fell 4.1% year over year. That's $17 billion in trade. That didn't happen. Meanwhile, Canadian exports to the European Union increased 8.3%. Exports to Japan rose 11.2%. Exports to South Korea jumped 15.7%. Prime Minister Carney visited China in November 2025 and signed expanded trade agreements. Carney visited India in December and finalized a comprehensive trade deal years in the making. These aren't just symbolic visits. They represent Canada's strategic decision to reduce dependence on an unpredictable American partner. From Canada's perspective, when 76% of your exports go to one customer who keeps threatening you, diversification isn't just smart, it's essential for survival. So let me be very specific and concrete about what actually happens if America tries to function without Canadian supply. Within 1 week, gasoline prices spike 30 to 70 cents per gallon across most of the country, more in some regions. 14 major refineries face potential shutdown. Natural gas prices in the Northeast jump 25 to 40% as supply tightens. Within 2 weeks, rolling blackouts begin in New York and New England during peak demand. Auto plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky begin slowing production as parts inventory depletes. Defense contractors receive notices about rare earth shortages. Within 1 month, major automakers announce production halts at multiple facilities. Vehicle prices spike as inventory depletes and production stops. Grocery prices begin rising as fertilizer costs affect agricultural supply chains. Within 3 months, agricultural yields begin declining as farmers reduce fertilizer application due to high costs. Food prices increase 10 to 15% across most categories. Electronics manufacturers face component shortages. Smartphone production slows. Computer assembly faces delays. Within 6 months, American nuclear plants begin reducing output as uranium inventory depletes. Coal and natural gas plants forced to increase generation to compensate spiking emissions and electricity prices. Defense production faces serious delays as mineral supplies run low. F-35 deliveries fall behind schedule. And all of this happens while America simultaneously fights economic conflicts with China, threatens tariffs on Europe, and tries maintaining global leadership. Every ally watches and recalculates their relationship with Washington. If America treats Canada this way, they think, what will America do to us? Trust erodes not just bilaterally, but globally. The irony should be obvious, but apparently needs stating. Declaring we don't need Canada while structurally depending on Canadian resources for basic functioning reveals not strength but ignorance. 4 million barrels of oil daily says you need Canada. 8.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas daily says you need Canada. 675,000 jobs in integrated manufacturing says you need Canada. The Pentagon's mineral strategy says you need Canada. Reality doesn't care about confident rhetoric. Reality is infrastructure built over decades that can't quickly change. Reality is supply chains optimized through billions in investment. Reality is dependencies that exist whether acknowledged or not. When rhetoric collides with reality, reality wins. Always. Eventually. The only question is how much damage gets done before that lesson sinks in. If this helped you understand what's genuinely at stake, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Can this relationship be repaired, or are we watching North America fundamentally fragment? I genuinely want to know what you think.